Okay, gentlemen, let's start into the last hour of today's lecture. Let's quickly recap what we did so far. We did a Blackboard session about why we should do logging, monitoring, telemetry, part 1. Part 2, we added Serilog, an alternative logging framework which adds a lot of functionality, especially syncs to our ASP.NET Core logging. And now we are going to tackle the topic of data validation. Data validation on the server side, and of course that has also large implications on the client side. Let's first try it inside of controllers, because that is the most easy thing to do. Please open up the log demo controller file, and at the end, or at the beginning, I really don't care, add a record, public record. Let's simply call it customer. And let's add 2 constructor parameters. The first one should be string name, and the second one should be int age. But I would like to add data validation attributes on top of them. You know them from Entity Framework. Something like required. Try that. Of course, you are going to need a using statement here. Or something like, let's say, max length. 50. And the second one might have, just for demonstration purposes, a range area. Here, the age might be between 0 and 100, just for demo purposes, okay? Just add a record with these view data validation attributes. You know the data validation attributes already. And we will find out how ASP.NET Core handles those data annotations. So far, we have primarily used data annotations for Entity Framework. Now we are going to take a look at them without Entity Framework. By the way, this code is, of course, also in my GitHub repository. Now let's add a web API with HTTP post. And let's say here we can create the customer by posting towards customer, to the customer route, customers route, plural. Public, async, result, something like this, create customer. And let's get the customer record from the body. So if we specify just the customer here, then ASP.NET Core will take the customer from the HTTP body. Let's quickly log something so that we know that the customer has been written to the database. We will not really write it to the database. We will just write a note, log.log information, writing customer, I don't know, something like name 2db, and specify the customer.name as a parameter. Okay? And at the end, we just say return OK. That's all we need to do. I will zoom in so you can easily, I cannot zoom in, it's too large, so I will just mark it for you. This is the code, pretty straightforward and simple, and this is the record with the data annotation attributes. Don't get a wrong impression, this is not real-world code, because when we would really create the customer, we should definitely not return OK HTTP 200, but we should return created HTTP 201. Okay, good. Should just work. Okay, so let's give it a try. Let's run this app. And then please use any HTTP client tool, any web API client that you want to use. In my case, I'm going to use Visual Studio Code, you know me. And just for today, I would like to use Thunder. I haven't installed Thunder. Why haven't I installed Thunder? Did I tell you about Thunder in the past? The Thunder client? Yes, no, maybe? Okay, yes, you say yes, good, thank you very much. Yeah, let me quickly show you what you can do with that. You can just run Thunder client with a new request. Okay, seems that Thunder did not install properly, so I cannot show you Thunder today. I don't know why. It works perfectly on my machine at home, but not here. Whatever. I'm going to do request HTTP with our good old friend REST client. Post HTTPS localhost. Use any client that you want. Do you want to use Postman? That's perfectly fine too. Log demo, customers, content type, JSON, and specify the name, which is foobar, and the age, which is 42. And if we run this guy, we should get back, okay. Nice, nothing special. That is not a surprise. But now please watch what's going to happen if we mess up, and for instance, if we do not specify a customer name. Consciously making a mistake, run the send request, and wow, what we get back is correctly a bad request, and we will get back the correct status code, we will get back a correct name, a correct error, and even we will get the information which field was wrong. You see that one? Do you see the code that is responsible for this very detailed error handling? Exactly, no. That's the magic of ASP.NET Core. Just by specifying a data transfer object, this is what we call a data transfer object, DTO in short. DTO. Just by specifying a DTO with data annotation attributes, the entire so-called modal validation is done automatically without us having to do anything. And it is properly logged. So if we take a look at sec, for instance, and if I refresh this here, I will see that I got the correct response here. With the 400, I see that it was a post, and I would see all the details which are inside of my code. So the point of this demo was just use data annotations and you are good. That's good news, right? At least I think that's good news. Unfortunately, if we have good news, there have to be bad news too. And unfortunately, I have bad news for you, and I would like to show you what this means. You do not absolutely have to follow along now. It's also in my repository, because this is more conceptual knowledge. It's not necessary that you really do that, because you will see what I'm going to show you now, you will not like it. So you will probably not do it. So let's do an app map post. This is now the minimal API. It's not in the controller. This is the difference here. We are now using minimal API, the thing that we learned at the beginning of this year. And here we do a minimal customer, something like this. And again, we are going to get the customer. That's the customer that we have defined in the other file, C. And then we want to do exactly the same thing that we did here, boom, inside of our other file. And the logger should be iLogger. No, I don't need the logging. I don't want to do the logging here. It doesn't pay off. Results.OK. Now we are good. Please imagine that we do the logging here. That's not the point. If I run that one now, it's exactly the same code, but now with minimal API. So I go to my Visual Studio Code. I change my call a little bit. I say minimal customer. I post it. I obviously made a mistake. Yeah. Not plural, singular. And you see, no modal validation. And that's the point what I wanted to show you. If you write the minimal API outside of a controller, you will not get validation. And that's a big drawback, isn't it? So if you want to have validation like the one I showed you before, and believe me, you want to have that, you should still use not the minimal API, but you should currently use the controller API. There will be changes in that area. So maybe in the next version of .NET, you will have the possibility to either turn on validation or you will get validation out of the box. We will see. But currently it is like it is. You do not get out of the box validation. For your reference, I created a sample implementation. You see it here in the GitHub repository where, and it's not necessary that you can read every line, where you need all this code in order to do the validation manually. You could do that, and it still isn't perfect, because this is the code that you do for manual validation, and it still doesn't work properly because it does not support records. So you can only use classes with that. So you have to write a lot of code more to achieve the same. You are not allowed to use records currently to achieve the same, so don't do it. This is why I told you don't follow along, because the point that you should take away from this demo is do not use minimal API if you want to build a real-world API with modal checking. If you just have 1 or 2 HTTP GET requests, that's perfectly fine. We did that in the last homeworks. But for a fully fledged web API, stick with controllers, at least for the moment. Good? Okay. So this was more of a warning sign than anything else. Nice. Good. Speaking about error handling, last demo of today. Can you remember we did a demo in the log demo controller in the last hour where here it is, where I threw an exception. You see that one? Invalid operation exception. Let's try that again to refresh our memory what happened when we had an exception in our web API. Now you can follow along again. Makes absolute sense because that is important and that is super practically relevant. I've shown you how this exception is logged to sec, log demo, and I think it was nothing else, just log demo. And you see I get an exception. I can continue, and what I will get back is this nice little information directly in the browser. So we'll get a human readable exception information with a proper stack trace. I can take a look at the cookies, the header, the routing, and a lot of other things. If you think that this one is useful, then I have bad news for you. You will only get it on localhost on your machine, because this website is the so-called developer exception page. You get it out of the box, but only on your machine. Don't think that this will be present when you run this thing on your production server. Let me show you what will happen when you run this thing on the production server. Please follow along. Go to Properties, and there you will find a file which you might have ignored so far. But now we will take a look at it. It's called launchsettings.json. Find it? First, delete everything about IIS. Have you ever heard of IIS? Or are you too young? Internet Information Server, ever heard about that? If you not have heard about that, you are on the lucky side. Believe me, old guys like me, we had to deal with this stuff. It was not a lot of fun to just delete everything that is related to IIS. We simply don't want to be reminded of those days. But the thing that I would like to you to do is I would like you to duplicate the profile with this web API error handling server. Please just copy it. Make a second entry and maybe rename it, maybe something like production at the end. And the important thing that I would like you to change is this one. It's the ASP.NET Core environment variable. It's the environment variable called ASP.NET Core environment. And you see here you said development. That would be a development server, and on the development server you get the nice exception page. This is for you as the developer to do troubleshooting. But on a real server, this would be either empty or set to something like production. So please try to change that to production. And then, magically, you have here the Web API handling server, and now you have, first you have to save the file. I'm sorry, I did forget to save the file. So again, so I screwed up with all these curly braces. It should be here. Thank you for pointing it out. So let me check again if I did it correctly. This one should be this one. That is okay. This one should be here. This one and this one should be that one. And I'm missing a final one here. Sorry, I screwed up with the curly braces, but now it should be correct. So save it again, and yoo-hoo, now it works. Thank you for pointing out my mistake. You were perfectly right. And now you see you have these two environments. Let's try the production version. So let's go to the production version and run it again. Let's make sure that we get the exception, log demo, and boom, we get the exception, continue to run, and this is what we see. This is what we see. We can even go to the network tab, rerun it. Yes, I know, debugger. And what I will get back, you see, just a 500. And if I go to response, I see nothing. Believe me, in a DevSecOps world, this is your nightmare. Because your customer will call you and tell you the app doesn't work, I see a blank screen. Then you ask him, what is the error message? Can you tell me any kind of error message here? And he will say, oh, I don't see any error message. It's completely empty. I get a white screen saying something about HTTP error 500. I have no idea what happened. What do we need in these situations? Logging. Because now we can go to SAC, refresh this thing, and immediately, you see, I get what I need to see. But the problem is that your customer might not be the only one having an exception. So you will have a pretty hard time finding out which requests came from which customer. Get the idea? So what we essentially want to do, we want to give the customer carefully selected details about the mistake. We don't want to give the customer all the details that we as developers need, with the stack trace and everything. But wouldn't it be nice if we just give the customer enough information that he could tell us in a support call what his problem was? And in order to achieve that, we can add unhandled exception handling. We can handle unhandled exceptions and return proper error codes. Now this is a little bit more code, and I've prepared it for you because it's not complicated and it doesn't pay off if you write it manually. Please open the program.cs and look for the code starting in line 44. And this is the code. It starts with if app environment is development. Sorry, if not app environment is development. Please copy this code, this one, and put it in your program.cs. Is it important where? I would put it in front of the map controllers, but it really doesn't matter. You will need to add a using statement. That should be pretty simple. And then your code should compile. Before we dive into the details, let's just simulate the problem again. Run your server in production mode, not in development environment, and enforce the error. Log demo, boom, and what do we get back? This is exactly what I wanted to see. I get back a JSON content, and this JSON content, besides some textual information, contains the request ID. See that one? And that's the important one. Because now I can ask the customer, hey, could you please send me the request ID via email, for instance? Then we can take this request ID, this one, copy it, go to SAC and say request ID equals to this one. And if we run this, we immediately, boom, tracked down the exception. And we know what the problem is for this specific customer, for this specific case. So it is best practice to add enough code to a production server to make it possible to identify the reason of the error. The customer does not need to be able to identify the reason, but there should be enough information in it so that the customer can copy this information, send it to you, and if you have access to the logs, you can find out what happened. That's also a question of security, because we do not want to expose our technical details to the customers, because those customers might use them to, I don't know, to maybe misuse a security flaw in our application or a known vulnerability. Question? Okay. You're one step ahead. Yeah, let's talk about that. I didn't just return any JSON, but I returned a very specific JSON. If you take a close look at the code that you just copied in, you will see that I will return here, in case of exceptions, a problem details class. Can you find it in the code, problem details? This problem details class is a specific class of ASP.NET Core, and it reflects a standard which is defined in the RFC 7807. You know RFCs? Huh? No? RFCs are standard pages. This is where the HTTP protocol is defined and things like that, okay? So if you follow this link here, this one, it will lead you to a standards document, this one. And this standards document, it's from the Internet Engineering Task Force, IETF. It's from March 2016, and it defines a standardized return code for errors in web APIs. And this is what you should adhere to. Your response should follow the designs here in this RFC. Then you are standard conform. And problem details give you exactly that. Now you asked, what about this type here? This type is a universal resource identifier. It's a URI. Don't misunderstand that. It's not a URL that you can really call. There is no website there. It's just an identifier for the root cause of the problem. Okay. Of course, you can write more sophisticated code to find out what the error was, and you can return different types for different situations. Mm-hmm. Did you have a database error? You might return a different type. Did you have a division by zero error? You might return a different type. It depends.
How do I do that? So how?
Please take a look at this link. That would be way too complex for now, because it's not that easy to access the error, the underlying error. But in this link, which I specified here, you find all the details. Okay. Yeah? Good. So problem details is a very important class that you frequently use when writing real-world web APIs. It will return a meaningful error message to the customer. And of course, all the log information will be, all the error information will be captured. A last thing that I would like to mention here, when we do those loggings, never forget that there is a thing which is called GDPR, General Data Protection Regulatory, DSGVO. You have heard about the DSGVO, GDPR? Yes. How does GDPR relate to logging? Why is that relevant? Yes?
Because we track all our users too.
Exactly, we track our users and we store personal identifiable information. Have you heard this term before? PII, personal identifiable information. Personenbezogene Daten, PII. Americans say PII to it. So if you store PII in your logs, you are under the legislation of the GDPR and you have to follow the guidelines there. That means you must not store the data longer than you absolutely need it. So you need to remove this data. So be very careful about what you store in your logs. Currently, our log by default does not store the payload. It only stores the headers, the status code, and so on. But we don't see the data that the customer posted. And that might be relevant because maybe the user posted some very highly sensitive data, maybe some medical records, and you do not want to store medical records about customers inside of a log file. Understand what I mean? So always think about what are you allowed to store, what do you really need to store, and only store this information that you really need to pinpoint errors. For instance, the IP address where the request came from. Is this personal information? Are you allowed to put that in log files, or is this already covered by the GDPR? It is covered, exactly. If you combine an identifier of the person with his or her IP address, you are under the GDPR. That's PII already. So think about whether you want to store the client IP of the customer. If you do not store the client IP, and if you do not store the user ID, then you just get technical logs and then you are not under the GDPR. Understand what I mean? So be very careful about that. Nice, this is what I wanted to show you. I wanted to talk with you about logging, monitoring, and telemetry. I wanted to show you some error handling techniques, how logging relates to error handling, how we can do unhandled exception handling, and show you some details about how ASP.NET Core handles all that. With that, I promised you something. Homework. Okay. Homework for the next 2 weeks, because next week is holiday. It's this one. I will copy it into the Discord server. Don't see this just as homework. It's preparation for the upcoming exam. If you do this homework properly, you will not need to do additional learning for the exam, okay? It's pretty obvious what you have to do. Your job, it's again in the Share for Future sample universe, your job is to implement a web application with which users can create offerings. We do not do a login. Just let the user enter the technical ID of his or her record and assume that this is the login. We do not need a real-world login. And then I want to have the following functionality. Get the list of all offerings for the current user. Display it in a table. Display at least those columns in the table. For every offering, I want to be able to toggle the currently available state. That's just a Boolean. You already have the entity framework model. We did that a few weeks ago. I want to be able to create a new offering where I have to specify at least these data items. I have to be able to alter an offering where I need to be able to alter at least these 3 fields. And your form should include basic error handling. So you should already, in the Angular client, detect things like, hey, this is a required field, but the user didn't enter anything here. So not very complicated. You should be able to do that within a few hours. Of course, use ASP.NET Core 6, use Entity Framework 6. Come up with your own web API design. Where do you use HTTP GET, POST, PUT, patch? How do you design the paths, the queries, and things like that? Include an open API specification. That's essentially a tick at the beginning of the project. It will not be complicated. Include basic error handling in the API. And write the Angular client with the latest version. Want to earn extra points? Add Serilog. Essentially, just apply the 3 lines of code in the program.cs that we did today. That's a cheap one. That's really a cheap extra point. And last but not least, if you want, you can incorporate the code that we wrote last week and replace the list of all offerings with a multi-word search that we did last week. You get a second extra point for that. This homework will take you, I think, between 2 and 4 hours, depending on how much you practiced already, and you have 2 weeks of time for it. If you manage to solve this problem within I would say 3 to 4 hours, you're good. If you struggle heavily with this homework, practice, because then you will have a problem in the exam. Any questions for the homework?